There is a story, and it is not Greek, it is not Norse, it is not Sumerian or Egyptian or Native American. It belongs to all of them equally. And it goes like this: a child is left behind, abandoned, orphaned, cast out, sometimes by a parent, sometimes by fate, sometimes by the gods themselves. And from that wound, something extraordinary grows. Hercules was thrown into a murderous rage by the gods before he could walk. Moses was pushed down a river in a basket. Oedipus was left on a hillside to die. The Hindu god Krishna was smuggled away in the night to escape a king who wanted him dead. Luke Skywalker grew up on a desert planet, parentless, staring at twin suns, dreaming of somewhere else. Different cultures, different centuries, different languages, same story. That is not a coincidence. And here is what I want you to sit with for the next 15 minutes, because this is the question that will not leave you once you hear it. What if every civilization on Earth kept telling this story, not because they copied each other, but because they all had the same wound? Carl Jung was Sigmund Freud's most promising student, until he wasn't. Freud believed human psychology was mostly about repressed desires, childhood experiences unique to the individual. Jung thought that was too small. He looked at myths from cultures that had never made contact with each other, and kept seeing the same characters show up. The trickster, the great mother, the shadow, the hero. He called these archetypes. Recurring patterns wired into what he called the collective unconscious. Think of it this way. If you've ever had a dream about falling, or being chased, or showing up somewhere completely unprepared, you didn't invent that dream. Millions of people across history have had the exact same one. Jung's argument was that human beings share a psychological basement, a layer beneath personal memory, beneath culture, beneath language. And in that basement live these characters, these patterns, these wounds. The scientific establishment was skeptical, and honestly, some still are. But here's the thing nobody can argue with: the myths. Because when you actually line them up, side by side, the pattern doesn't bend, it holds. When most people hear wounded child archetype, they picture a shy, sad figure in the corner. But Jung's wounded child is not passive, it is the exact opposite. The wounded child archetype is the part of the psyche that was hurt earliest and deepest, and as a result, carries the most raw, unfiltered energy of all the archetypes. Jung noticed that the characters in myths who are abandoned, rejected, or harmed in childhood almost always become the most powerful figures in the story, not despite their wound. Because of it, the wound is not a flaw in the narrative. The wound is the engine. Think about the orphan heroes of Jungian psychology the way you'd think about pressure in a steam engine. The more it builds up with nowhere to go, the more force it eventually releases. Hercules becomes the greatest warrior. Moses becomes the liberator of an entire people. Krishna becomes the avatar of a god. The wound does not diminish them, it defines them. But here's where things get interesting, because this isn't just mythology. This pattern shows up in the psychological development of real human beings too. For most of human evolutionary history, being separated from your group as a child was a death sentence. Literally. You needed your caregivers, you needed your tribe. Abandonment did not mean loneliness, it meant the end. So the human brain encoded this experience. The fear of it, the memory of it, the survival response to it, at a level so deep it became almost genetic in its consistency. When Jung talked about the collective unconscious, he wasn't speaking mystically, though it can sound that way. He was pointing at something neurological. The same fears, the same wounds, the same recovery patterns, generation after generation, carve themselves into how human beings process experience. And then storytellers across every culture independently discovered that when you build a character around this wound, audiences feel something they cannot explain, because they recognize it, not from another story, from inside themselves. Now here's the part that tends to stop people cold. This is where the wounded child archetype stops being a psychology concept and becomes something that reaches into the deepest structures of human spiritual life. Jesus Christ is abandoned by his Father at the moment of his greatest suffering. My God, why have you forsaken me?" Those are not the words of a man who felt held. The Norse god Odin hung from the world tree, Yggdrasil, alone and wounded in order to gain wisdom. The Egyptian god Osiris was dismembered and scattered. The Hindu god Shiva lost everything he loved. Even in Shinto mythology, the creator deity Izanami descends into darkness and decay, cut off from the living world. Across polytheistic, monotheistic, and animist traditions, the gods themselves get wounded, the gods themselves get left behind. And from that divine wound comes the most sacred gifts: wisdom, resurrection, creation itself. Ask yourself, why would human beings, trying to describe something all-powerful, keep giving their gods this specific vulnerability? Because it was the only wound they understood deeply enough to trust. the one that felt true at the most fundamental level of human experience. So why does this matter? Because it tells us something about what we do with pain. This is probably the most important distinction in understanding Jungian archetypes, and it's one that most casual explainers miss entirely. The orphan hero archetype is often confused with the victim archetype. They share an origin, loss, abandonment, suffering, but their trajectory is completely different. The victim archetype remains defined by the wound. It circles back to it endlessly, uses it as an explanation for everything, draws identity from the injury itself. The orphan hero acknowledges the wound, sometimes very slowly, sometimes painfully, and then moves through it. Jung was clear that integrating the wounded child did not mean denying the pain or pretending it didn't happen. Integration meant carrying the wound without being owned by it. The hero of myth does not forget what was taken from them. They carry it, and in carrying it consciously, they gain something the uninjured person never could, an understanding of what it means to lose something and survive. This is sometimes called the wounded healer pattern in Jungian psychology. The idea that the person best equipped to guide others through a particular kind of pain is the one who has already walked through it themselves. Every culture seems to arrive at this truth independently, and this next part might surprise you, because the wound also shows up in the stories we least expect it. Think about the stories that hit the biggest numbers in modern culture. Harry Potter, orphan raised without love, discovers extraordinary power. Batman watches his parents die, transforms grief into a mission. Spider-Man loses his uncle because of his own inaction, carries that guilt as fuel. Simba in The Lion King, his father's killed. He runs, he eventually returns. Elsa in Frozen, locked away by the people who were supposed to protect her, exiled by fear of her own power. These are not recycled plots. They are the same mythological structure that Sumerian storytellers used 5,000 years ago, running through a Disney animation pipeline in the 21st century. The inner child wound does not care about the century. It does not care about the medium. It just keeps surfacing, because human beings keep needing to tell this story. And when you understand the wounded child archetype, when you can actually see the pattern, you start watching films and reading books and listening to songs differently. You stop asking what happens next and start asking, what is this story trying to heal? But the most unsettling version of this pattern isn't in fiction at all. Jung spent decades working with patients who were living out mythological patterns without knowing it. A man who couldn't stop choosing unavailable partners, reenacting an early experience of emotional abandonment. A woman who drove away everyone who got close to her, unconsciously protecting a child self that learned closeness meant danger. Patterns that felt like bad luck or personality quirks, but were actually the wounded child archetype running unchecked through an adult life. The Jungian term for this is the shadow, the parts of ourselves we refuse to look at directly, which then operate from behind the scenes. The wounded child, unexamined, becomes a shadow driver. It makes decisions from fear of repetition. It reads every new situation through the lens of the original injury. And because we're not conscious of it, we genuinely believe we're just choosing freely. What makes the myth hero different is not that they were less wounded. It is that at some point in the story, they turned around and looked at the wound directly. Every hero's journey has this moment, the descent into the underworld, the dark night of the soul, the cave you have to go into. Jung called this confronting the shadow, and every ancient storytelling tradition has a version of it. The myth at its most useful is a map. It is showing you that someone has been here before. Someone survived this specific kind of pain. Here is how. Here is something worth noticing. In the mythological record, children are rarely just children. They are divine, or cursed, or prophesied, or both. There are almost no myths about completely ordinary children having completely ordinary childhoods, because that is not what myth is trying to say. Myth is not interested in documenting average experience. It is trying to capture the felt sense of what it is to be small in a world too large to understand. Every child, at some level, experiences the world this way. The adults around you are operating on rules you do not yet have access to. The world can remove things from you without explanation. You have power you do not yet know how to use. You are, in a very real sense, the orphan hero at the beginning of the story, before the quest has started. Jung argued that we never fully leave childhood. We carry versions of every age we have ever been, somewhere in the architecture of the self. The wounded child does not age out, it waits. And it speaks in the particular register of old injuries replaying in new contexts. The cultures that understood this most deeply, and the evidence suggests most of them did, built that understanding directly into their most sacred stories. So here's the question I want to leave you with. The endpoint of the wounded child archetype in Jungian psychology is not triumph in the conventional sense. It is not power or revenge or even healing in the tidy way we tend to imagine it. The endpoint is integration. The orphan becomes the king not because they stop being the orphan, but because they stop being ashamed of it. Moses does not forget the river. He carries it. Harry Potter carries his scar. Simba carries the memory of his father. The wound becomes the credential, the thing that makes you fit for exactly the role you were wounded on your way toward. And what is extraordinary about this, what genuinely keeps me up at night, is that this understanding did not emerge from one culture and get exported to the rest. It grew independently, in parallel, across every inhabited continent. The Yoruba people of West Africa told this story. The Maori of New Zealand told this story. The ancient Vedic scholars of India told this story. Mesopotamian priests told this story. Carl Jung did not invent the wounded child archetype. He named something that was already there, carved into the collective unconscious of the entire species. The oldest stories know something about us that we keep forgetting and keep being taught again. The child at the beginning of every myth, the one left behind alone in the dark, with nothing but a wound and a name, that child always gets up, every time, in every culture, in every century. That is not just mythology. That might be the most honest thing the human race has ever said about itself. The wound that begins the story is the same wound that makes the hero worth following. Every culture knew it. Jung just gave us the language to say it out loud. If you've ever felt like the kid left behind at the start of someone else's story, I want you to remember, the myths kept telling you where that goes, and they never once said it stays that way. If this hits something in you, the video on Jung's shadow self goes even deeper into the part of us we don't want to look at, and why looking is the only thing that actually helps. Link is right there. And if you want more of this kind of thing, the place where ancient story meets modern psychology, subscribe. I put something new out every week, and I think you'll like where this goes next.